In this video, we will create a simple deployment on the simple environment we've created. We'll then improve the deployment code by checking for the existence of deployments on an environment. We'll finally look at deleting deployments. Now we have an environment created. Let's create a deployment in it. Let's start a new Python file and call it create.dep.py. We'll keep the code that created the environment when it does not exist. And we'll add our new deployment code. In this case, we use getDeploymentBuilder. Deployment type is self. The deployment name, we'll call it mynewdep1. We then create a new deployment instance, which uses the build method on Deployment Builder. Deployment name is set to our dep name, which is mynewdep1, and the environment is set to the environment we currently have selected from above. We use the engine version 5.50. The engine type is DC, that is, a data collector. The install type is Docker, and we can use the add deployment method. And then the start deployment method, with some print statements in there, in much the same way that we did add environment and activate environment for environments. Also, in a similar way, we could put in a test to see if this deployment exists. For the moment, we have code that creates an environment if it does not exist. And our deployment code will say, for the current environment we selected, create a deployment on it. So if I ran this script a second time, a second deployment of the same name would be created under our environment. Let's run the script for the first time. Checking if environment mynewEnv1 exists. mynewEnv1 does exist. It tells us the environment ID for it, and then it goes into the adding deployment and starting deployment. So when we look in Control Hub, we have our new environment. Refresh to make sure we don't have another. We have a new deployment and the environment name it belongs to is mynewEnv1. Let's run the script a second time back in PyCharm. It says mynewEnv1 exists again. So the environment already exists. And then it says, adding new deployment, mynewdep1, and starting deployment mynewdep1. Looking in Control Hub at the deployments list again, and you can see we've got two deployments. The first one has the environment mynewEnv1, and the second one also has the environment mynewEnv1. Let's delete this environment and its deployments for now, manually, but later we'll remove these with the SDK. Back in PyCharm, we'll put in some code that checks for the existence of the deployment. Replace what we've got with that new code that checks the existence of a deployment. We have kept the declaration of Deployment Builder as before, and Deployment Builder with the build method as before. Everything else is the same with regards to the settings. Is the entry for the data collector type, and that's DC, also the engine type, and that's what we had before. What we're adding to this is code to extract a list of all deployment names in the system, just like we did with environments, and check if the deployment already exists. Essentially, our new script will create an environment if it doesn't exist, and will create a deployment in the given environment. If the environment already existed, then it will create a new deployment in it, providing that deployment did not already exist in it. Let's examine the code. This code extracts all the deployment names in the system. In a similar way that we did for environments, we can go through this array of deployment names and test to see whether each one equals the name that we set. MyNewDep1. If it does equal it, we set the flag exist equal to 1. If that flag is set, then we extract the environment ID that is associated with that deployment. We then test to see whether that environment ID we extracted here is equal to our extracted environment ID, env-ID, that we extracted further up. If it is equal, then the deployment with that name exists in our environment already. Another flag, createDep, is used to determine whether to go ahead and add and start the new deployment. This works as follows. createDep will stay 0 if the deployment already exists and it exists in our environment, so we don't want to add or start a new deployment with that same name in our environment. createDep will take the value of 1 if the deployment does not already exist in our environment. It could, however, exist in a different environment. That's fine. In this case, we are okay to add and start that new deployment in our environment. So, if the createDep flag is set, then we can go ahead and add and start our deployment. Let's test this out. We have no environments or deployments at the moment as we just deleted them. So let's run this script. We're adding the environment myNewEnv1. We're activating the environment myNewEnv1. We're checking if the deployment name exists in the environment. The deployment name does not exist, so we're adding it and then starting it. In Control Hub, we can see that the new deployment myNewDep1 now exists in the new environment myNewEnv1 as before. Let's try running the script the second time. This time, it should not recreate another deployment in our environment. Checking if environment myNewEnv1 exists. myNewEnv1 does exist as an environment. Checking if deployment exists. Deployment myNewDep1 exists in environment myNewEnv1, and the deployment that we found is that. So in Control Hub, if we refresh the deployments, we can see we still only have the one deployment, and a duplicate was not created. There are some parts to a deployment that are done only when the deployment already exists. For example, adding stage libraries. If we check our currently created deployment, choose Edit. Let's go down to Save and Next. So you can see that we have 5 stage libraries. These are Data Formats, Dev, Windows, Basic, and Stats. That is, the basic ones that are provided. We want to change these to what we see in the code here in PyCharm. Running the script one more time will alter the stage libraries of this deployment. Here, we're using the engine configuration.stagelibs to define exactly what stage libraries we require. For example, we want JDBC and SDK Snowflake. Then we're using the external resource source method to add an external resource zip file, which may contain JDBC drivers, for example. We then just update the deployment. Running the script one more time will now alter the stage libraries of this deployment. You can see the message we get on the end here, verifying the stage libraries that we're currently trying to configure. Let's check the deployment stage libraries back in Control Hub. So we go into the deployment, myNewDep1, edit it, then Save and Next. So you can see we still have 5 stage libraries, but they are a different 5 from what we had before. We now have Basic, Data Formats, and Dev as before, but this time we have JDBC and Snowflake. Now let's consider deleting the deployment. Here is the code to delete our deployment. It's very simple. We're not checking for the existence of the deployment first like we did with the environment. So if the deployment does not exist, the script will throw an error. If we look at the deployments in Control Hub, we can see we've got myNewDep1. And that's the one we're going to try and delete. When I run the script, we get stopping deployment deleting deployment, and then exit code 0. Let's check in Control Hub. Click on Deployments, and you can see it's removed that deployment. As said, the script could be made more useful by checking for the deployment existence. And in fact, you could check to see which environment it belongs to as well, to ensure you pick up the correct one. Thanks for watching.